An intriguing ruin carved into a Sardinian cliff face.
It's not only the fact this tunnel sort of leads out to sea, but it comes out halfway up a cliff.
An eerie facility in the USA with a Gothic look and feel.
Those gargoyles are very strange, almost like they're guarding something or perhaps warning people about what's inside.
A top-secret building in Japan that may have called a nation to war.
The unit stationed there burned all the radio transmissions, all the receipts, everything else that was there, so we have no paper record of what actually went in and out of that place.
And an extraordinary underground labyrinth of tunnels in southern Ukraine.
So increasingly disoriented underground, these Russian secret police begin to hunt each other.
Decaying relics. Ruins of lost worlds. Sites haunted by the past. Their secrets waiting to be revealed. On the outskirts of Louisville, Kentucky, perched on the top of a hill, lies the battered shell of a huge, imposing building.
It's not the kind of place you'd stumble across by accident. It's pretty secluded. To get to the place, you have to take this long, winding drive that snakes up the hill.
At first sight, there seem to be more questions than answers.
You can't really tell if this is the front or the back of the building.
How do you get in? It's a bit disorienting.
This rambling structure seems to go on forever in every direction.
While ominous-looking creatures gaze down from above, inside there's an eerie, confused picture.
We have to ask, why are these abandoned? What terrible thing happened here that makes people want to stay away?
And how is it linked to a modern-day global pandemic? A 3-story solarium dominates its southern face. Could that unlock the mystery of this building's original purpose?
There would have been a bed pulled out in front of every single open doorway, all the way down and around this thing, across the whole back.
Dale Clark grew up just 5 miles away and has been showing people around here for the past 18 years.
And then there were usually smaller children's beds shoved up against the brick wall on the outside. And there was just a little path between the foot of the beds over here and the side of the beds over there. They spent a good chunk of their time out here.
It must have been a very strange sight coming up that driveway and seeing all the people out like that. But what were they doing out there? It's not like there's a view of the ocean or the river or anything like that.
This is Waverly Hills, a 180,000 square feet facility built to house more than 500 people. But here, the devil is in the detail.
So if from the outside it looks like maybe it could be a fancy hotel or retreat, the inside has a very different feel to it.
There's not much left behind, but there are odd bits of medical equipment.
This is not just a place of life here in the hills of Kentucky. What we're looking at is a place of death.
This is the morgue. We have no idea why this room is so small. At the worst cases, a body an hour, this little room is going to fill up very quickly. That's why there's a maintenance department down the far end of the building that's 4 times the size of this. It became the auxiliary morgue during the worst of it.
When you need to have an auxiliary morgue, you're taking a lot of bodies.
Waverly wasn't alone. The body count was piling up all over the United States and around the rest of the world.
It hit the U.S. so badly that they had to form a national committee to deal with the problem.
A global pandemic of this disease struck terror into the hearts of everyone.
The disease was tuberculosis. Built in 1942, this was more than just a hospital.
You've also got dentists and barbers and even a gift shop.
Patients are not just here for a few days. The patients are here long enough to grow their hair long and get it cut. They need to function in this place for the rest of their lives.
Children that were born in Waverly had to be taken away from their mothers immediately after birth. The risk of contamination was that severe. And it gives you some sense of how long people were confined here if they were having children born here.
The story of a patient called Lois demonstrates the heartbreaking realities.
She was a mother of 2 when she got here. And if a patient was doing better, they would allow them to go home on furlough and then have to come back. She came back, and it didn't go well. She had conceived a child while she was gone. To our knowledge, the only time Lois ever got to see her son that was born here was standing in one of these solarium windows looking at the road that ran across the back of the building as somebody held him up.
Patients need to be isolated. They need to be kept away from cities and towns where they could cause thousands of infections and thousands of deaths.
It can survive in the air, and it can attack any organ in your body, but it usually goes for the lungs.
The Victorian name for it was consumption, because it consumes your body from the inside. At one point, across America and Europe, 1 in 7 deaths were down to TB. 1 in 7 people died of tuberculosis.
Jefferson County, Kentucky was one of the worst hit places in the country.
Fortunately, Waverly Hills rose to the occasion.
Waverly is as good as it gets. Here is a place where you're going to be looked after by the best.
If you're going to try out a new procedure, Waverly was where you're going to try it out. And they were really at the cutting edge of TB treatment.
But in the early 1900s, the best tuberculosis treatments were still experimental, to say the least.
Procedures we talk about most of all in here are autopneumothorax, which is basically where they would let air into your chest cavity and manually collapse one of your lungs. It's very, very painful. They thought, mistakenly, that while the lung was collapsed, it would rest and heal itself.
Medical science had not yet learned how to deal with this disease, and that the best way to heal was for the patient to heal himself or herself.
Aside from these procedures, there were only 3 treatments thought to be effective against TB: fresh air, sunshine, and nutrition.
This building has areas purpose-built for that. Here, along these massive balconies called solariums.
These are the best treatments they had, but as we know from the number of people that were dying here, it wasn't really that effective in the end.
There are hospitals today which have a whole separate set of corridors for moving dead people out of rooms.
The solution here was more direct: a body chute.
It was not originally built to be a body chute. It was built to bring up building supplies and materials. All the mechanism, machines, the track, and everything that was built to bring bricks up, they just reversed it and took bodies down. At the bottom, there was a little building. It was basically storage, so they could either be loaded into hearses, ambulances, train cars, depending on where they need to go.
This is just a grim form of architecture, but totally necessary.
And scrawlings on the walls serve as a reminder of the risks taken by the staff who worked here.
The employees were the original graffiti artists. There's a lot of names signed in pencil. Quite a few of them are dated, and some of them are very old. It's just to let themselves know that they're still alive, that, you know, they came and did a horrible job, took a chance on getting deathly ill, and a lot of them, you know, survived.
But in 1943, a scientific breakthrough meant the beginning of the end for the Waverly Hills sanatorium. The antibiotic streptomycin was developed. It was the cure the world had been waiting for.
Without streptomycin or similar antibiotics, tuberculosis would still be a plague even in the developed world where it's rarely seen.
It's no longer needed in the 21st century, but it's such a monumental building, it has to reinvent itself in order to find a purpose today.
Closed as a TB sanatorium in 1961, Waverly Hills is now frequented by people looking for something entirely different.
If an unmerciful God allowed the souls of the departed to roam the world, then this is just the kind of place people imagine unquiet spirits would be.
A nurse who'd gotten pregnant by a doctor who was married to someone else mysteriously was found hanging out here in the hallway across from the elevator car. Just that right up there is where she was found. Was she just overcome? Or a lot of people think that maybe something more sinister happened. No one will ever 100% for sure know exactly what happened to her.
For most of the world, TB is seen as a disease of the past. But recent studies have suggested that might not be the case.
The original strain, they can pretty much take care of. The problem is there's a new strain coming out that is very antibiotic resistant, and the old treatments just aren't working.
Tuberculosis is nature continuing to this day to claw at human life and to force us to fight back.
Scientists across the globe are racing to find treatments for this new strain of TB and entirely new viruses and diseases that threaten a global pandemic.
It's almost like an arms race with these terrible diseases. And we hope that we're winning, but it's a close battle.
Despite their devastating effects, these battles bring humanity together in new and inspiring ways. On the Italian island of Sardinia, in the blue waters of the Mediterranean, an intriguing ruin clings to a cliff face.
You see this structure that just boggles the mind. It looks like some ancient building, but it starts maybe 100 feet up this rocky cliff.
Has some of it fallen away? It's a really strange juxtaposition from cliffs to something that's almost like plastered on the side.
Now, it might look on the face of it that there's been an engineering catastrophe here and the cliff face has fallen away, but no. This is purpose-built, and what you see is what you're supposed to see.
Inside, the full extent of the complex is revealed.
The tunnel itself is quite extensive. It goes several hundred meters into the mountain. You have to have a big incentive to blast your way through such hard rock.
Ultimately, you see there's 2 levels of tunnels, and you can see that there is a series of bins in between the 2 tunnels with some kind of gate at the bottom of each bin.
This is an amazing site with great ingenuity, and it really is what gets people into engineering. You give someone a problem, and with enough imagination, they come up with an amazing solution.
Antonio Litaru is an expert on the history of this place.
Even during the Roman era, prisoners came here. They were doomed to work here. And we have a particular term, damnatio ad metallo. They were damned, condemned.
And yet, this structure is far from ancient.
It's not as old as it looks, actually, and it's quite beautifully engineered. This was not an ancient monastery or some kind of strange castle. This was something industrial.
A closer look at the tunnel walls reveals the type of rocks that are buried in the hillside.
You've got rocks that are very, very old and rocks that are very, very young. And all through those different eras, you get times when you're having magma, which causes mineralization and causes things like silver and lead and zinc.
Along the coast, visible from the cliff face, are the remains of a sprawling complex that hints at an operation on a truly industrial scale.
You can see rail tracks, huge storage chambers, all sorts of things going on an epic scale.
You're almost dwarfed by these rusting bits of machinery, and it's clear that somehow this tunnel, these two places were linked.
One of the biggest challenges of mining here is getting the ore off the island. For centuries, there was no real infrastructure.
In the first part of the 20th century, the material was transported by the so-called galantieri. They were basically like miners. They transport all this material on their shoulders, on little basket cases.
The lead and zinc ore was hauled to the coast by oxen cart, as men and beasts of burden alike toiled in the baking Sardinian sun. And from there, things got even tougher.
You have hard rock, hard basement rock. You often end up with rugged, rocky coastlines, cliffs, inaccessible areas, so they don't necessarily lend themselves to big ports.
Small boats transported the ore to the nearest deep-water port. That was 15 miles across the treacherous open sea on the island of San Pietro.
The area itself is quite precarious in terms of weather. You've got the Mistral winds, these cold winds coming down from the northwest off France, and you've got the Ponete winds that come in from the west.
These boats could only hold about 6 tons of ore. That's a remarkably small amount. I mean, that's just a few wheelbarrows full of ore. And they would load them as heavily as they could. So now you've got this little open boat trying to get to a harbor some distance away where it can be loaded into a bigger boat. It's full of rocks. These boats sank all the time. It was incredibly dangerous, slow, inefficient.
They're quite precarious little boats, so you can imagine you're loading a boat full of rocks and then you're trying to get it off. If you've got bad weather, those boats could easily topple over, and many did, and many people fell to their deaths.
To solve this age-old problem, the mine owners turned to Venetian engineer Cesare Vicelli.
And this guy was a real genius, one of those out-of-the-box thinkers. Vicelli spent a year studying the problem and studying the geography around the mine and the coastline.
They found this sort of wonderful site where a sea stack was actually protecting the waterway between the sea stack and the land, and it was deep water, so in principle you could get big ships in there. But then your issue was creating a port.
Vicelli's solution was Portoflavia.
Instead of taking the ore to the ports, they would bring a port to the ore.
He said, instead of building something new, why don't I use a structure that's already there? Normally, any mariner looks at this coastline, looks at that cliff. This is their worst nightmare. And yet here they were planning to turn this forbidding cliff into a port facility.
Construction began in 1923, and the teams here worked day and night for 2 years.
Now all they had to do was blast out thousands of tons of rock.
They finally broke through the cliffs and they could see the sea. But they didn't stop there.
And then here comes the really scary part. They started hanging out over the water. That way, as they dug the tunnel, they could just shovel all the rock out into the water. And again, they repeated the process of drilling and blasting until they'd carved out a parallel tunnel below the other one.
The miners then dug 9 vast chambers connecting the 2 tunnels.
The silos are huge, 20 metres high, and between the 9 of them, they could hold up to 10,000 tonnes of minerals.
This is the mechanism they used to open the iron mouth of the hopper. You see right here. This opened, and a lot of material came down from above. Here, once we had a moving belt.
With the final machinery installed, the system was complete. Electric trains from the mine arrived at the upper tunnel, where the ore was poured into the 9 huge silos. Meanwhile, large cargo ships waited in the calm waters below Portoflavia. In the lower tunnel, the ore poured onto the conveyor belt, before a 50 feet long retractable arm which extended out over the sea dropped it into the ships waiting below.
At the end of that boom was kind of a rubberized sleeve. So as all that gravel and rock was tumbling down, it wasn't just going to spray everywhere. It was all going to go directly into the hold where it belonged.
In fact, they could turn around one of these ships in 2 days, loading up to 500 tonnes an hour directly into the hold.
So a really amazing engineering feat, and they used the cliff and the geology and the whole function of gravity, really, to aid them in that process.
Portoflavia was a huge success. It slashed production costs by up to 70%. But increased efficiency came at a price.
It produced a lot of wealth for the company, and for this reason, a lot of galantieri, the workers that lost his job.
Global forces eventually put an end to the port's good fortune.
Sadly, the company didn't have that many years to enjoy the efficiency of their brilliant engineering. At the end of the 1920s, you had the stock market crash and then the Great Depression. Then you had World War II. It reopened for a few years in the 1950s. But by the 1960s, there were new efficiencies, new technologies.
The last shipping occurred in May of 1963. And since that day, it has remained in the memory of citizens and miners and workers.
Portoflavia is now preserved for visitors. It's both a testament to the vision of one great engineer and a tribute to the lives of generations of Sardinian miners.
This port shows engineering at its best. You throw someone a challenge of how to get a huge amount of material out when nature is against you, and they came up with this incredible, imaginative solution.
On the banks of the Black Sea in southern Ukraine is a port city founded by Catherine the Great. The stylish architecture above ground gives no clues to what lies beneath.
Every so often you hear a story of some young people who go down and someone gets lost and doesn't make it back out again.
Some researchers say that we have approximately 800 accesses.
These access points range from the obscure to the downright bizarre.
When you look at this shed, it might just be some kind of equipment shed. And then you go inside and realize it gives you access to the most incredible underground labyrinth anyone has ever seen.
It's absolutely quiet place. The silence is 100%. As soon as you switch off your torch, then the darkness is absolute.
Few people walking the streets of Odessa realize what lies beneath their feet.
As you go down, it's clear that it's not just a normal set of tunnels. It's actually much more grand than that.
They just don't understand that they're literally walking above the underground city. It's the biggest such system in the whole world.
A subterranean system perfect for a criminal underworld. Yet it also served as the city's last line of defense against an occupying force, a resistance movement that formed part of a horror story.
So month by month passed, they began to get insane.
Increasingly disoriented underground, these Russian secret police begin to hunt each other.
The city of Odessa owes its very existence to one of the world's most iconic female leaders.
The Russian Empress Catherine the Great wanted to build a new port city in order to open up the south of Russia to commerce. A mighty port where the three great rivers of Eastern Europe came together: the Bug, the Dniester, and the Danube.
They desperately wanted access to a port on the Black Sea, and via that, the Mediterranean and the rest of the world.
In 1794, Catherine approved funding for Odessa, which soon became a Russian trading superhub.
So Odessa went from being basically a village to a large city almost overnight. They had a problem, though. In this area, there aren't a lot of trees. It's grasslands and farms. So for building materials, they turned to the local stone.
And luckily, they were sitting on a particular type of limestone, which is very, very good for making buildings out of. So they used the geology, or the rocks beneath their feet.
This gave birth to a subterranean world that Pavel Zagny-Baroda now explores for a living.
Local authorities, they try to control it somehow, but it's almost impossible, really. No mobile phone connection, no radio communication, no GPS signal reaches that deep. So you can rely only on yourself, on your own knowledge.
Yet even he may never understand the full extent of the system.
No one's really sure, but one estimate is that there's about 1,500 miles of tunnels.
Now, if you put that into context, Paris has got about 150, 200 miles of tunnels. Rome maybe about 300 miles, so it's 3 times both Rome and Paris combined.
The layout of these tunnels is extraordinarily complex, and it's not just on one level. They go down on multiple levels.
So you've got a kind of complexity in terms of the different types of rooms and corridors, but also it's multi-tiered. It's actually on different levels. They've used different parts of the geology in different ways. It really is a labyrinth underneath the city.
You can imagine how someone could become dangerously lost down here, but also how someone who really understands the network and knows their way around could use it to their advantage.
And in the city's darkest hour, this world beneath the surface would offer a glimmer of hope.
During World War II, the Romanians were allied with the Germans, and they attacked Odessa and took it over in 1941. The Soviets pulled out, but they actually left behind some secret, what you might call like special forces.
A group of Soviet secret police, a group of the Cheka from Moscow, and another group from the Odessa office are sent down into the catacombs.
At the head of these units were Majors Kuznetsov and Koloshin, and Pavel has discovered signs of their time here.
Kuznetsov and Koloshin. This group was exactly here. We found some bullets, some batteries for radio station, some guns as well. They were well trained and prepared to act as a partisan. So they had water, food, guns, explosives, mines, whatever they needed for a long time to stay here.
But they weren't prepared for the psychological challenge, the isolation, the darkness. You know, we hear about people on polar expeditions who really struggled. Imagine if you're down in a tunnel for 6 months without seeing the sun, maybe only able to light a candle once in a while. Some of the men turned violent, perhaps suicidal.
They also had to contend with the invaders using poison gas in the catacombs and sealing exits in an effort to trap and smoke out the rebels. Here, danger lurked around every corner.
Of course, partisans are always vulnerable. You know, it just takes one person spilling the secret.
Along with Kuznetsov is Yevgenia Semeryunik, and she is a traitor.
Semeryunik a member of the surface team betrayed her unit. She turned informer, telling the Romanian security forces everything she knew.
We don't know why she did this. She betrayed all of them. So first of all, they arrested all 13 people in the city, of course, and then they blocked all the exits for this underground team.
But Eugenia Semerunyuk's betrayals were eventually discovered by her compatriots.
So she is put on trial in a brief, informal people's trial and put up against the walls of the catacombs, and she's shot dead. But now, the two groups of communist partisans mistrust each other fatally.
They began to get insane. So they really got absolutely mad. After approximately 10 months, they began killing each other.
The two of them hunt each other in a silent vendetta. And in the end, none of the Soviet partisans emerges from the catacombs alive.
Having dispatched Koloshin and his Moscow team, Kuznetsov had finally been killed by one of his own men. But declassified documents later revealed that one man did survive to tell the tale.
So he came to the security services of Soviet Army, and they came here, and so he showed them everything. And they just shot him dead in his back, right here. On the third day, after the liberation of the city, he was killed by his own people after 3 years of this terrible hell underground.
And so, the last living eyewitness to this horrific tragedy had been removed. It appears that the Soviets were not about to allow the reputations of their heroic resistance fighters to be tarnished by the realities of the story.
Because for propaganda, they needed absolutely different story. It may seem that all these people, all these partisans, they died for nothing, like completely in vain. But it's not true, because Romanians, they didn't know how many exactly there were partisans hiding underground.
Tens of thousands of troops were stationed here throughout the war to save the city from their unseen enemy below.
I think that it was this huge contribution of these partisans into the victory.
Pavel now runs part of the catacombs as a museum, bringing centuries of history to life. From the city's birth, through piracy and smuggling, right up to the nuclear bunkers of the Cold War. On the edge of a bay in the southwest of Japan is a complex that's been towering over the land for decades.
This is set in beautiful landscape. There's water and trees everywhere. And then right in front of you, these three huge towers are just there. They're massive.
We're looking at a really tall, 400- or 500-foot high towers, very slender, tapering upward, almost like concrete needles. They look almost like smokestacks.
If you can take a peek inside the tower, you see a long, precarious-looking metal ladder going up to the top. Whoever had the job of climbing that ladder certainly didn't suffer from vertigo.
The fact that there's three of them, it makes you question, why wasn't one good enough? Why did there need to be three?
Only when it's viewed from above is that question answered.
They form a perfect equilateral triangle. And then at the center of this triangle is some sort of a building.
It's so overgrown, it's been forgotten. That building has been completely wrapped up by the plants and trees that surround it.
Inside the building, there's not much there. Clearly, this was an important installation of some sort, but when it shut down, whatever was there got taken away.
The complex is linked to the gravest military disaster in US history. But the bare rooms and the hollowed-out towers paint an incomplete picture.
Whatever these towers were built for, you don't see a lot of infrastructure. There's no lights or cables or other things. Is there some other piece of the puzzle that's missing here?
Dating back to 1918, the towers have stood guard over the site for more than a century, thanks largely to their once cutting-edge design. Hideaki Matsuo is a historian with a deep knowledge of their construction.
If you head to the back, you can see the lines in the wall. Each layer is 4.5 feet tall. After the first layer, you have to wait for another 2 days before you can add another one on top. And after completing 100 layers, this 446-foot tower was finished.
The decision to build the tower with reinforced concrete, despite the high costs and the slow rate of progress, indicates how important it was to get the construction exactly right.
It took 4 years to build this at a cost in today's dollars of nearly $50 million, which speaks to the sophistication of the technology employed.
Looking like an industrial chimney from the outside, the central winch system shows that this was really all about reaching new heights.
When you go to the back, there is a ladder. It's the original one, and there are 550 steps to the top. To reach the top takes 55 minutes, and you have to keep climbing without a break. There is nowhere to rest in between. It is quite a hard climb, and it's slow.
Today, an aircraft warning light sits on top of each tower. But years ago, there was some very different equipment here.
What's missing from the structures today are the aerials, which were in the form of triangular frames, and they would have sat on the top of the towers. Between the towers were connecting wires, and that linked all of them so they became one.
Together, they were used to transmit radio signals over great distances.
Radio waves come in a range of wavelengths, from very short ones to very long ones, and it's the long waves that most easily travel long distances. But to create a long radio wave, you need a very big antenna.
The towers were part of the Harrio Wireless Telegraph Station. They were designed to remedy a long-standing and costly problem.
One of the forgotten wars in world history by many is a brief war between Japan and Russia in 1904, but it was a time when Japan actually tried out a lot of their technologies. And in that war, they really learned the importance of good communication.
Prior to radio communication, the standard way of sending a message between ships was by flag.
Navies around the world developed very sophisticated systems using flags and other signals where they could communicate from ship to ship and coordinate their activities. But communicating from ship to shore was always a problem. Once you were over the horizon, you were on your own.
In the modern world of the 1920s and 30s, flags were outmoded and outdated.
Japan would soon start trying to expand. They had imperial ambitions, and so communication was paramount to this.
They want to measure themselves against Great Britain, against the United States, against the French Empire, against the Russians. And so for this, they're going to need a really modern communications array so that Tokyo Central can communicate with the Japanese Navy wherever it is.
There were actually 3 complexes like this. One in Taiwan, one near Tokyo, and this one close to Nagasaki. The 3 could communicate with each other, so you could relay a message from one to the next and beyond, but they could also broadcast messages far out over the ocean. If you have better communications, better information, you have a huge edge in any military conflict.
There was one building here that was vital for success, It was crucial to the Japanese military victories of the 1930s, and as the Second World War crept closer, it was about to be put to use again. It may also have had a part in one of the gravest events in US history.
This is the rooftop of the telecommunications room. It is also the center of the 3 radio towers. Those radio towers are positioned in an equilateral triangle, almost 1,000 feet apart from each other. And this is located right in the middle of those towers, which was important. Cables coming from those 3 radio towers were connected to the telecommunications room, but the telecommunications room itself was hidden underground.
With war on the horizon, meticulous preparations were carried out. The facility was made highly secure and self-sufficient.
The building housed the power to run the whole operation in the form of generators and batteries, but it was also where communication was sent and received.
Messages were picked up by the towers, relayed to this building, decoded, and then retransmitted to their original destination. This dark space certainly had the potential to cause untold damage.
This room was where they transmitted the secret codes that were created in Sasebo. From the size of the room, and because we know there used to be 5 or 6 desks in here, we presume that there was a small number of transmission workers in here. However, as they were dealing with highly confidential documents, I don't imagine many people were allowed in.
In 1941, a top-secret coded order that shaped the course of history is likely to have filtered through these rooms.
There's good reason to believe that one of the most pivotal radio transmissions in history was made via this transmitter. The words, "Climb Mount Nitaka, 1208." Those words were code to send the instruction to proceed with the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Once the order had been given by Tokyo, it's believed that Haruo actually transmitted the fateful message from mainland Japan to the waiting naval fleet. The attack on Pearl Harbor was devastating, and it immediately drew the United States into the war. But questions about Haruo and its role in all of this remain unanswered to this day.
There's almost no documentation remaining about the Haruo radio site. Architectural drawings, records of transmission history, and so on. They don't exist at all. The reason being that straight after the war ended, any related documents were burned.
While the Japanese may have destroyed any incriminating and damning paperwork, they couldn't make the very real concrete evidence here disappear.
We can't say for sure that the order to attack Pearl Harbor came from Haruo, because after the war, the Japanese destroyed all the records that were stored there. But given the configuration of the various transmission sites in Japan, it probably came from here.
Today, the prominent towers help to caution another generation not to repeat the mistakes of the past. And it's hoped that they'll continue to sound their warning for many years to come.
These towers were designed to last for about 90 years, but the way they were engineered and constructed means that they'll last for a lot longer than that.